All right, well, I guess I'll start by inviting the candidates to line up so we can get you all seated. And we'll do this in alphabetical order. So first we have Stephen Bailey. Please give him a round of applause. Next up is Xavier Becerra. Eric Early. And Dave Jones. Feel free to have a seat. I got to get through a couple of programming notes and then we'll move on to opening statements. So first thing is to learn more about the candidates. Bios and websites for each of the candidates are included on the program agenda. We have to say that the views expressed are those of the candidates and not those of BizFed Institute, Southern California News Group, the Los Angeles County Business Federation, also known as BizFed, and Southern California Gas Company. Sponsorship of the forum is not intended as an endorsement of any candidate. Again, I was asked to remind you to maintain a civil environment of nonpartisanship and refrain from verbally responding for or against a particular candidate or otherwise impeding the progress of the forum. I'm told we have security and they will drag you out of here. I'm kidding. I'm not really, but other than that, I'll give you a little bit about the format and the rules. So the candidates were selected on a listing of candidates from the campaign fundraising reports through the California State Secretary Cal Access Records. The seating arrangement was done alphabetically. For the questions, each one will be given a minute to answer, and we will allow for some follow-ups, 30-second follow-ups, although use them sparingly, and a chance for rebuttals based on my discretion. At the end, we will take a Q&A from the audience. You're asked to have your questions submitted to event staff by 2:40 p.m. And then we will, and now we'll move on. So we're going to start with opening statements, and they've been randomly selected from a hat. We were throwing dice in the back room because we can do that now thanks to the Supreme Court. No, I'm kidding, but we did draw them out of a hat. So we'll start first with Dave Jones. Or maybe we won't.
Test 1, 2.
There we go.
Got to turn the mics on, guys. We need an attorney general with experience, vision, and independence to confront the challenges faced by California. And that's why I'm running for attorney general. This is something I've been preparing for. I'm the only candidate on this stage that's actually led a statewide consumer protection and law enforcement agency for over 7.5 years. Now, I agree that we need to do everything we can to resist the Trump administration's attacks on California. But there's more to the Office of Attorney General than just suing Trump. And here's what the San Jose Mercury News said when it endorsed me. We had higher hopes for Mr. Becerra when he was appointed, but beyond his legal challenges to Trump, he's often been a huge disappointment. In contrast, Jones understands the multiple demands of the office and will provide much-needed political independence. State residents deserve nothing less. The appointed Attorney General spent his career in D.C. Until his appointment, he hadn't practiced law. He surrounded himself with political aides, some of whom can't practice law in our courts. He's taken contributions from the oil industry, from big tobacco, and from big insurance. I'll be independent and not beholden to anyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
First, let me thank the BizFed and everybody who sponsored this. Thank you very much for letting us come together. My job as AG is to protect California families, to protect our values and protect our resources, and in fact, to protect our resourcefulness. We don't become the 5th largest economy in the world simply by sitting back. We become that because we work very hard, and we do everything we can to put everything together the right way with everyone pulling along the way. And so my job is to make sure you're succeeding. But my number one job has to be public safety, to protect us against the criminals, against the sex traffickers, to make sure we're going after those who are lawbreakers. I intend to do that, and I hope I have a chance to tell you about the things that we have already done in the year and 4 months that I've had as the Attorney General. But bottom line is this. Like my parents, a construction worker and clerical worker, my job is to make sure that today's construction and clerical worker can not only buy a home, send kids to college, but retire in dignity. I do job one well, we'll all succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bailey?
Thank you, and thank you to BizFed and everyone here who is here today to watch this debate. I am a retired California Superior Court judge, and as such, I'm running for Attorney General to bring a sense of law and rule of law back to the Attorney General's office. It's no longer satisfactory here in California to have criminals running rampant on our streets, having the crime rate going up in double digits. It's time to put an Attorney General who is focused on California's problems, not Washington's problems. As your next Attorney General, that is going to be my one and only focus, and that is on the problems of the people of California, the issues that face us on a daily basis, on the men and women who are trying to make a living here in this state. And as your Attorney General, I won't pick and choose which laws I'm going to enforce. California deserves better than we're getting now. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Early?
Thank you, BizFed, for having us. Thank you, Gilbert, for arranging this. I'm Eric Early, and I'm running for Attorney General of the once and future great state of California. I own and run a 25-lawyer law firm, and we fight for our clients in courts throughout the state and much of the rest of the country. I make payroll every 2 weeks. I understand business. We represent businesses big and small. I'm not a politician. Sacramento is in deep and serious trouble. Years of one-party rule have led to a steep increase in crime, taxes out of control, businesses being regulated out of our state, felons here illegally being treated better than our taxpayers. The list goes on. Sacramento needs new life, new energy, and new ideas. These lifelong political professionals, politicians, have helped create a failed state, and so I stepped up. It's time for an outsider with new vision, new blood, and new energy to begin the work of making California great again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And don't put that mic away yet, because you're actually first on the next question. All right, so, yes, sir. And perhaps what will be the understatement of the event, the state of California and the federal government have been at odds. And perhaps what will be the understatement of the event, the state of California and the federal government have been at odds. And on a number of fronts are actively engaged in legal battles. The most recent tally I could find was that we are currently suing Washington on 32 separate functions. Is that correct, Mr. Becerra? Yes. Okay. With that being said, my first question may be more philosophical. In our complex legal system, what is the proper role of a state attorney general?
The proper role is to make sure of the public safety first and foremost of our citizens and uphold the laws of the state of California, whether they're civil, criminal, and stand side by side with law enforcement, quite honestly. You asked about the 32 lawsuits. I think it's an outrage, quite frankly. I think Mr. Becerra is obsessed with Donald Trump. It is not the role of the state attorney general to be suing our federal government every 5 minutes. Mr. Becerra was appointed, he wasn't elected, and in the little over a year he's been in office, he's filed 32 lawsuits against the federal government. A year, 32 lawsuits. It's outrageous. There are all kinds of problems in this great state that are being ignored. It's one of the reasons I'm running.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jones?
The Attorney General is the chief law enforcement officer of the state of California. As a progressive Democrat, I would certainly file the same lawsuits resisting the Trump administration's efforts to undermine California values. But there's more to the office than suing Trump. For example, the appointed Attorney General has failed to take weapons away from 10,000 people that by law shouldn't have guns. The appointed Attorney General has failed to go after ExxonMobil for its contributions to climate change. The appointed Attorney General has failed to make sure that a database is up and running that physicians can check to make sure there isn't an overprescription of opioids. The list goes on and on and on. I'll bring the same fight to the game with regard to federal incursion on California's rights, but we need to do everything else that's an aspect of the job of Attorney General, and I'm committed to doing that as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bailey?
Thank you. The role of the Attorney General, quite frankly, is to protect the interests of business and the people of the state of California first and foremost. The Attorney General's role, the federal government doesn't do everything right. There is a time and a place for the Attorney General to be involved in taking litigation against the federal government. Unfortunately, what we're faced with here in California is a whole series of frivolous lawsuits that have no basis.
Mr. Becerra?
I said at the very beginning, my job as Attorney General is to protect you and protect your values. And that's why we went after Backpage.com, the largest worldwide trafficker of sex, and brought them down and prosecuted them and got a conviction. That's why we've gone after gangs in about 6 or 7 jurisdictions throughout the state of California and taken them down along with the sheriff's departments and police departments locally. That's why we've gone after some of the biggest polluters in the state, and that's why we continue to do what we must to protect your opportunities to succeed and thrive and create the jobs that have made us the economic engine for the country. At the same time, we'll go after anyone who tries to stop us from becoming that economic engine, including the federal government, which is constitutionally overreaching in its powers, and 32 times I've done it to defend everything we've done, from a woman's right to get birth control under the Affordable Care Act, from Americans' opportunity to serve in the military, whether they're transgender or not, or whether you're an immigrant and wish to be here under the DACA program. We're going to fight for your values because that's what has made California the 5th largest economy in the state, in the world.
Thank you very much. A follow-up to that question is, then what is your criteria for taking action against the federal government? When has the federal government gone too far and you need to defend the state's rights? And we'll start with Mr. Becerra on this one.
Scott, that's pretty simple. If there's a constitutional overreach, because we respect federal law and we act consistent with federal law, and so anytime the federal government tries to make us do things that we're not required to do under the Constitution, we will protect our interests. If they have a better way of doing it, if they have a better way to help us create more jobs or help us build on the fact that we graduate more people from college than any other state in the nation, then we'll listen. But if they simply want to break up families, if they simply want to deny women the same rights to health care that we give to men, then we're going to stand up and protect our values. When Ashford University decides it wants to be a predatory for-profit college and take the money of hardworking families, we're going to fight to stop that. And we're going to do what we must to protect your opportunities to continue to make California a place where people want to come. There is no state that comes close to us when it comes to population, economic prowess, and the ability to create more new jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey?
Could you repeat that question again, real quick?
Well, as I mentioned, 32 times we've taken action against the federal government. Some on the panel have said that that's too much. When is the right time?
Well, you know, here's what the problem is in California with the Attorney General. The Attorney General's focus has been so much on the tweets that are coming out of the President's office that every tweet requires a lawsuit. Quite frankly, things like border walls, those are issues that Congress had decided many years ago. It was frivolous and a waste of taxpayer money to bring that kind of lawsuit. DACA needs to be dealt with by the Congress. It's not something that requires a California lawsuit. Here we are spending literally hundreds of thousands upon millions of dollars of taxpayer money on lawsuits that, if they were brought in our state courts, the state judges would be declaring the Attorney General a vexatious litigant. It's ridiculous and silly.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Early?
Yeah, your question was about what criteria the government's using to sue the administration, and quite honestly, I don't believe there is any criteria right now other than the fact when the federal government takes an action, suddenly they get sued. The resistance has set up its office in our California Attorney General's office. With all due respect, Mr. Becerra, to me you're like having Nancy Pelosi on our Attorney General's office. It's been completely politicized. We've lost touch with what the people of our state need, from major law enforcement issues to homelessness to this serious mental illness that's become, the homelessness which is becoming an epidemic, and on and on and on. So I don't believe there's any criteria now. If there is actually a constitutional overreach, then the Attorney General's office should look at it. But these 32 lawsuits, most if not all of them, are not dealing with constitutional overreaches. And when I'm Attorney General, our office is going to look at every one of these 32 lawsuits and decides which ones need to be dismissed.
Mr. Jones?
So the criteria are pretty simple. It's whether California's laws, rights, programs, or Californians are under assault, and they are. Whether it's the effort to deport our neighbors or colleagues or friends or the friends of our kids, whether it's the effort to undermine women's access to reproductive health care, whether it's the effort to roll back health care reform, whether it's the effort to drill off our coasts, whether it's the effort to undermine our efforts to fight climate change. It's a long list, and all of those are appropriate areas for litigation if the law supports it. And as Attorney General, I will be very aggressive in fighting back against the Trump administration. But you got to make sure the office isn't politicized. And the current appointed Attorney General has brought in political operatives, some of whom can't even practice law in California courts, and I think that's wrong. He's taken money from the insurance industry, from the oil industry, from big tobacco, from the bail industry. I think that's wrong. You have to be independent. You have to operate the office in a non-politicized fashion, and that's exactly what I will do.
Thank you all. All right, now I want to shift to a particular topic, immigration. It's another one of those subjects where we've had a back and forth with the state and federal government. Now, while the Constitution doesn't specifically mention immigration, it's long been ruled that it's a federal responsibility. So when does it become a state issue, and what role should the state government play in enforcing federal immigration law? And we're going to go to Mr. Jones first.
The California sanctuary city and sanctuary state laws were carefully crafted to reflect the fact that immigration is a federal responsibility, but the state does not have to be an instrumentality of the federal government when the federal government is seeking to deport people whose only crime, quote unquote, is coming here as undocumented. Think about this. Unless you're a Native American or descendant of slaves, every one of us descends from people that came to this country looking for political opportunity or freedom or economic opportunity. We're all immigrants. And the notion that the federal government would require the state to participate in something as terrible as ripping people from our communities, I think is anathema. So I will defend the sanctuary state and sanctuary city laws. A.G. Sessions lied when he described what those laws do. They are carefully crafted to allow state and local law enforcement, when you're talking about felons who are here illegally, to cooperate with ICE. But short of that, no. So I think they've been appropriately crafted, appropriately drawn, and that is essentially the best exemplar of the respective roles of the federal and state government.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
Let me see if I can try to clarify something, because there should be no confusion. The state doesn't have the power to enact immigration laws. Only the federal government can do that. What the state has the right to do and the power to do is to enact its laws under the federal Constitution and pursuant to the 10th Amendment to enact laws with regard to its public safety and its general welfare. And so simply what we do is we decide how we use our law enforcement resources. The federal government can't tell California how to use its police. And that's all we're doing in these different laws that people call immigration laws. They're not immigration laws. They're either public safety laws where we're telling our local law enforcement what they can and cannot do, which we have the power to say, or, for example, protecting people's privacy at the workplace, where we say some employer cannot just give away an employee's privacy rights of information at will. But we respect federal law. We must, because under the federal Constitution, the states don't have a prerogative when it comes to immigration powers.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Early?
Yes, the sanctuary state law violates the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. It is not protected by the 10th Amendment, as Mr. Becerra just said. The supremacy clause trumps the 10th Amendment. The sanctuary state law is a misnomer to begin with. It should be called the Illegal Immigrant Felon Protection Act, because that is almost exclusively what it is being used for. It's being used to protect those people who came here illegally and have been committing crimes, oftentimes violent crimes, since they got here. State and local law enforcement should be allowed to work with ICE to get those people. We are not talking about the 2 million moms and pops who came here illegally and who've been not breaking the law since they got here, have been working their best to become part of the American system. Nobody's talking about deporting 2 million people. And I'll tell you, if I'm Attorney General and anybody tried to do that, I would stop that. But we should not be protecting criminals, people who got here illegally and have been committing crimes since they got here. The federal government's lawsuit is on sound constitutional footing, and I support it.
Thank you, sir. Keep your applause to a minimum, please. Mr. Bailey.
Yes. The sanctuary state law is, quite frankly, unconstitutional. It is not carefully crafted. It is simply a protection of convicted criminals. It's allowing for the release of repeat drunk drivers, those who've committed human trafficking, those who are gang members, those who commit domestic violence in this state. Those are the people that even those are immigrants that are undocumented don't want in their neighborhoods. And I certainly don't want them in my neighborhood. Frankly, sanctuary state needs to go. And I fully support the federal government's lawsuit against the state. I think it's the policy we've developed here is bad and failed policy. More importantly, the U.S. Supreme Court has already said that states may not and are prohibited from creating their own immigration policy. And that's what sanctuary state has done.
Thank you, sir. I want to go back to a particular piece of legislation that Mr. Becerra mentioned in his last remark, and that's AB 450, the Immigrant Worker Protection Act. I wanted to mention that because keeping our business-minded audience in mind, I wanted to ask, and for those of you who maybe don't know, it, among other things, prohibits employers in California from allowing ICE agents into their workplace or access to employee records without a warrant. It also carries financial penalties of up to $10,000 for an employer who voluntarily allows ICE into their place of business. So what do you say to an employer that has received a request from ICE, and how should they proceed without running afoul of state or federal authorities? And we'll go to Mr. Becerra first. Yes, sir.
So you would use your common sense in that regard. If there's a law that says you cannot disclose an employee's private information, then you should respect that. If the federal ICE authorities come to you and say, we'd like to have access to private information of your employees, you can say, well, under the state law, I have to ask you for some basis for your request. You provide a warrant, then you can provide the information. If the federal agency doesn't provide you a warrant, then you're under an obligation to protect someone's privacy, which would be common sense. But now under the state law, which was passed AB 450, you're now under a legal obligation by our statutes. That's all it says. It doesn't say you must not cooperate with ICE authorities. You can still turn over the information. ICE just has to give you a legal basis to do so. You can imagine, if you're an employer, if your employees had Social Security numbers and someone came up to you and said, even if it's a law enforcement authority, I want your employees' Social Security numbers, you still would want to say, on what basis do you legally wish to get that information?
Thank you very much. Mr. Early?
Listen, Mr. Becerra threatened businesses in this state when they were put between a rock and a hard place on this issue. It was wrong. Our businesses should not be threatened. Our businesses should be treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Our businesses create the jobs in this state for our people. It's behavior like that that is sending businesses out of our state. We have to do whatever we can, and the Attorney General's office has to do whatever it can to get businesses out of this line of fire between this federal and state dispute. It's something, when I'm Attorney General, I'm going to work on doing. We need business owners and job creators to be able to focus on creating jobs and supporting our working people and creating those jobs for those working people, not putting them in the middle of these insane legal issues. They're not lawyers out there. They're business owners and creators. It's a completely different skill set, and God bless them. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Jones?
So all that state law says is that the federal government, before it uses its enormous power and reach and coercive force, has to have legal process in order to get the information. It has to have a warrant. It has to have some sort of process. It can't just go on a fishing expedition. And so what business owners should do is inquire of ICE whether, in fact, they have a warrant. Do they have any kind of legal process that requires to turn over the records? If so, turn them over. If not, don't. Now, I want to go back to something Mr. Early said a moment ago. He said that nobody's talking about deporting 2 million undocumented immigrants in California. Well, that's exactly what Sessions is talking about. That's exactly what ICE is talking about. And that's exactly what's going on right now. Families are being separated. Parents are being torn from their children. Our neighbors are being taken away in the dead of night. And I think we ought to resist it. It's not right. It's not who we are as Californians. And it's not good for the economy. And it's not good for law enforcement either, because it drives people underground who are oftentimes themselves victims of crime. It's just bad. We have a big difference on that one.
Can I respond to that? Can I
Please keep
respond
the
to
applause to a minimum. What was that?
Respond to that?
30 seconds.
Law enforcement and ICE are not going out there and taking people who have not committed crimes since they got here in the dead of night. That is fear-mongering, and the people you put in the most fear with irresponsible statements like that, Mr. Jones, are the community of people here who are undocumented, who've been working hard to become part of the American system, who are not being deported, who are not threatened with deportation. There's 2 million undocumented immigrants in this state. If there were mass deportations going on, I can assure you, every one of us would know about it. Not happening. Stop the fear-mongering.
Please keep your applause to a minimum. I saw that Mr. Becerra wanted to respond, so 30 seconds, sir.
So again, it's everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And the fact is this: ICE is rounding up people who have no criminal records. They call them collaterals. They may be going after someone who does have a criminal record, but they don't discriminate. If they find you there with someone that they're looking for, they'll take you as well. So, Mr. Early, what you just said is factually untrue. Secondly, you were saying a falsehood when you said I threatened businesses. I simply told business community what the law says. I didn't threaten them. I simply tried to provide them the information about what the law currently says.
Thank you.
Can I respond to that, too?
No. You know, look.
I'd love to.
Oh, we got to get Mr. Bailey in here.
You know, here we are, we're debating an issue. California's set up a system that puts our businesses, particularly our small businesses, in the untenable position of having to pick and choose as to whether they're going to be prosecuted by the federal government or by the state government. That, quite frankly, is wrong. This issue of the sanctuary state legislation itself has the collateral consequence of creating a situation where we're forcing ICE into our neighborhoods. That's exactly what we shouldn't be doing. If we were just allowing ICE to function the way they wanted to function, and that is going to the local jails and picking up lawbreakers, you wouldn't have the collateral consequence that the majority in Sacramento, including our current Attorney General, have created in California. This is where the system has gone wrong.
Thank you, sir. And I want to, a quick reminder that 5 minutes left for audience questions or raise hands, and someone will be around to collect it for you. All right, I want to move on, but I want to keep on the state-federal issue, and I want to speak now to marijuana. And as we know, it's legal now in the state of California, but it still remains illegal on the federal level. As Attorney General for the state of California, how do you reconcile those two issues? And we'll start with Mr. Early first.
The people of the state have voted. They've said that recreational marijuana should be legal. It's now the Attorney General's job to uphold that. I believe it's a states' rights issue. The federal government at first threatened to come in and do something about it. Jeff Sessions has now backed off of that, and that was a smart move. The main thing we have to be responsible now for as Attorney Generals is the public safety of our citizens. When I'm Attorney General, I want to focus on figuring out a way to come up with the equivalent of a DUI test for those driving impaired under marijuana. We don't have that test right now. We have to figure out a way to make sure our dispensaries, the money coming from those dispensaries is placed in a safe depository because there's too much cash floating around right now. It needs to be protected. But we need to switch and focus on public safety first and foremost on the marijuana issue. It's one of the things I want to do. We can't have people driving around high on marijuana. It's going to put all of us in danger. If we do, we need that test. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
The voters decided to legalize marijuana, and that's a good thing. This state, like many others, engaged in a war on drugs that resulted in the mass incarceration of largely people of color for non-serious, non-violent possessory offenses where people are put into prison for inordinately long periods of time, made harder, and then released to communities with felony brands on them, unable to reintegrate. So I support the legalization. As insurance commissioner, I've been doing everything I can to get insurers to write insurance. I support getting banking facilities as well. I support the very complex and comprehensive regulatory regime that the state is standing up to make sure that the product can be tracked from seed to stem. I also think it's important for the Attorney General to make sure that once that regulatory regime is up, that those that are continuing to participate in the black market are held accountable. And that means making sure the laws are applied in a fair and uniform way so that those that are getting licenses aren't at a competitive disadvantage from those who are not. And you know this as business owners and operators, how undermining it is to have the underground economy where other businesses cheat. As Attorney General, I'll go after exactly that.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Becerra?
I believe the people of California spoke on this, and they did the right thing. We decided to regulate versus criminalize marijuana, and we can move on from there. What we now have to do is make sure that we get it right when it comes to law enforcement. That's why I have been meeting with sheriffs and police chiefs throughout the state, also with the 4 U.S. attorneys who represent the state of California at the federal level and the Department of Justice, because we have to coordinate our resources to be able to go after the black market. Because if the black market grows too strong, it's going to overtake those who try to do it the legal way, and then we undermine this new industry. And so we have to do everything we can to first provide the law enforcement that's necessary, especially in the rural areas where a lot of our sheriffs aren't equipped to deal with what's going on with the grows out there. Secondly, we have to deal with the fact that you cannot bank if you are in this industry. And somehow you have to figure out what to do with millions of dollars you have in cash, because that could lead to more criminality. And so the faster we're able to move in that direction and get the federal government to come on board, the quicker we'll be able to make sure that we do, in fact, regulate, not criminalize marijuana.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bailey?
Yes. The role of the Attorney General is to enforce the laws passed by the legislature of the people of California. When they spoke on marijuana, that didn't necessarily mean that the policy was a good policy. But from that perspective, it's not up to the Attorney General to decide. The unfortunate side effect of marijuana, however, is increased criminality in our rural areas and in our cities. The cartels are not going away. And in fact, the cartels are using California to transport to other sections of the country. The Attorney General's office needs to be taking the lead in suppressing this type of crime. It's going to get worse. Huge cash economy in marijuana. It's not going to go away, and the gangs and the cartels are going to be the chief beneficiaries of this, not private business people in California.
Thank you, sir. And I want to go back to something that both Mr. Becerra and Mr. Early mentioned, and the issue of banking and just a lot of cash moving around. What would you tell as Attorney General banks in this state to do when a marijuana collective or somebody comes to them with a bag full of cash and wants to bank it? And we'll start with you, Mr. Becerra.
What I've been telling a lot of these new businesses is that they have to make sure that they are very secure in their business, that they have the security that they need as they transport the money. We're trying to figure out if there's a way for the state to create a chartered bank that will allow the industry to be able to bank its resources. And I continue, as I said, to talk to the federal government to explain to them the importance of trying to deal with this growing industry that goes well beyond California. This is a bipartisan issue where I have had conversations with attorneys general from throughout the country, Republican and Democratic alike. whether it's the state of Nevada, state of Colorado, state of Washington. We are all working together. We have approached the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, and the Trump administration to make it clear that our people are not turning back in our various states, and what we want to do is make this as legitimate an enterprise as possible, and we need their help to make sure that those who are willing to do it the right way have that opportunity.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
The Treasury Department has a sub-agency called FinCEN. FinCEN's issued a memo to the financial services industry telling you that if you're in a state that's legalized marijuana, you've got to separately report any of the proceeds you're taking from marijuana-based businesses. So there is a Department of Treasury guidance to banks, to credit unions, to other financial services organizations that you should take a look at and follow if you take those proceeds. Look, there's some risk there, right? But as mentioned a moment ago, President Trump announced in a conversation he had with a U.S. Senator that he's going to not enforce federal law in those states where marijuana has been legalized. I just sent a notice to 1,300 insurance companies I oversee telling them this and encouraging them to write insurance. What's happened in other states is small credit unions and community banks have come into this space and offer banking facilities. I think that's beginning to happen right now. And so my advice to you would be follow the FinCEN guidelines, report what you're collecting.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bailey?
Banking of cash is going to be a continuing problem. Moreover, the black market in marijuana isn't going to go away, and they're going to continue to run a cash business. So whether you have what you pretend to be a legal marijuana business in California, it's always going to be pretend until the federal government makes a final decision on it. I don't support setting up a separate California bank here to handle marijuana cash.
All right. Mr. Early?
Listen, we're in a brave new world in California. Marijuana has been legalized, and as many of you may know, somebody who now is properly licensed, and only people properly licensed should be allowed to sell this stuff. When they get the cash in from the sales, they can't go to the bank and deposit the money because it's a federal banking institution, and it violates federal law. So if I was to instruct these folks running these businesses, I would say, listen, secure the money as much as possible, and from the Attorney General's office, we in the state have to work with the feds. We have to also look at the other states where the same situations, where legalization has been allowed. We have to figure out a way to secure this money and allow this money to be deposited. When too much money is floating around and there's no control over it, you know that's a prescription for danger, for trouble, for crime. We can't have that. And also, we want, even though I'm generally anti-tax on the marijuana sales, I'd like to tax those revenues and get that money to law enforcement, because law enforcement needs those tax monies. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. We're running out of time for my dictatorship before we move to the question and answers, but I wanted to ask you this one because I've heard from a number of folks in the business community that are concerned about this, and it's about the establishment of the Bureau of Environmental Justice. And so my question, and for those who don't know, the Attorney General established the Bureau of Environmental Justice earlier this year. And so I wanted to ask the panel, what does environmental justice mean in a legal context? And again, keeping the audience in mind, what would you say to manufacturers who are concerned this focus on environmental justice will make it harder for them to continue to do business in California? And we'll start with Mr. Bailey.
It doesn't mean anything. What it means is an agency that can oppress business and be used for political purposes. If I'm Attorney General, we're going to eliminate it.
Well, that was easy. Mr. Jones?
So I would have established a greater emphasis on environmental protection from day one as Attorney General, not waited a year and a quarter to do it. The appointed Attorney General has failed in holding big oil accountable for contributing to climate change. Specifically, he refuses to join litigation and investigation that New York and Massachusetts Attorney Generals are conducting of ExxonMobil, which lied about the existence of climate change, notwithstanding having its own scientists for decades send memos up to the CEO and board saying climate change was real, it's man-made, it's going to have an impact on oil prices. I would be far more aggressive in protecting the environment than has been the case under the current Attorney General. I'm not taking money from the oil industry. Mr. Becerra is. But in using that office, I think you have to be balanced I think you have to be thoughtful and you have to be deliberate and not politicize it. And so I'm independent, I'm balanced, I'm thoughtful, and I won't politicize it.
Thank you. Mr. Becerra?
Sometimes when you grow up in areas that you think are middle class, you find out all of a sudden when you finally get to see middle class homes that you really didn't. Oftentimes people don't realize they're living in places that have been degraded by what's gone on around them. And because these communities don't often have the resources and the support that they need, they continue to live in degraded environments. Justice is just that. If you want to abolish justice, you can go ahead and do so. But in America, we do respect justice. And I believe when it comes to the environment, every community is entitled to make sure that they are treated fairly. And that's why we established a Bureau for Environmental Justice, to make sure that communities, whether you live in East LA, where all the freeway interchanges are, or if you live in San Pedro and Wilmington, where you see the pollution from the harbors, that you are taken into account when decisions are made about the projects that will be around your neighborhood. Your kids deserve that, and we'll fight for that as much as we can in the Department of Justice.
Thank you. Mr. Early?
Nobody wants to protect polluters, but what happens with our environmental laws is that they're almost exclusively used to abuse businesses, abuse business owners. Mr. Jones is already talking about suing Exxon. Mr. Jones has politicized his office before by demanding that insurers divest from coal investments, which has really nothing to do with the insurance industry. The term environmental justice, quite honestly, is sort of an alt-left term that satisfies the alt-left. We need to protect our businesses. We need to stop strapping them with over-regulation. We need to create an environment where California is friendly once again to business. It hasn't been for many, many years. We have got to stop, for example, this CEQA abuse, where you have these law firms out there that sue over CEQA issues and prevent developers from building and stop jobs from being created. As Attorney General, I'm going to look at all these rules and regulations, see which ones go too far, and see what we can do to limit them.
Looks like you want to rebut, Mr. Jones?
Yes.
30 seconds.
Making sure insurance companies are not invested in things that are declining in value has everything to do with the job of insurance commissioner. Take a look at the facts. 35 coal companies gone bankrupt. The 4 largest U.S. banks won't invest in coal any longer. The Dow Jones stock indices over a 4-year period declined 92% with regard to the coal index. The list goes on and on and on. I don't want insurance companies holding an asset, in this case coal, that's going to be worthless. And so, yes, I did ask them to divest. As a financial regulator, concerned about them holding an asset that becomes stranded on their books and isn't available to pay claims. And that's exactly what you elected me to do as insurance commissioner, is to make sure they have sufficient assets to pay claims.
All right, I'll stop you there.
Can I respond to that or no?
All right, 30 seconds.
Listen, Mr. Jones, when you did that, coal was the hot button issue. It was, your side of the aisle. You can't support coal mines, coal workers. So you came up with this pretext to stop the investment in coal industry. It had nothing to do with the strength of the insurers. You completely politicized the office for that purpose, and who knows how many coal businesses and coal miners you put out of work because of that.
A rebuttal is, I think, necessary. Look, again, I know he doesn't know anything about insurance regulation, but the job is to make sure insurance companies aren't holding assets that are declining in value. I could talk another 20 minutes about all the indices with regard to coal declining in value. And yes, that is my job, to make sure they're not holding things that decline in value. And yes, I said to them, you ought to get out of coal. I don't want them holding things that are declining in value such that they won't have resources available to pay claims. Now, I'm not alone in this regard. Other insurance regulators across the globe are taking the same steps. International insurance companies are divesting from coal on their own. Major international banks have refused to lend into coal infrastructure. Why? Because all the signs are negative with regard to the value of coal, and Trump can't change that.
All right, and we're out of time for that portion, so that's where we're going to end it. But I want to go to audience questions now. And I also want to thank those who are joining us online on the live stream. I appreciate your watching. So the first question is, since January 1st, 2018, 23,000 Americans have died from drug overdoses. What are your plans to address this epidemic in California? And we'll start with Mr. Early.
Really, I'm the only one in this race who's been consistently talking about what I call the three-headed scourge of severe mental illness, homelessness, and prescription drug abuse. And I have strong thoughts on both the first two, but the question was as to the drug abuse epidemic. I want to look strongly. I don't like suing businesses, but I want to look strongly at going after Big Pharma, who's been behind, who's made billions and billions of dollars off of this, off of dosing our people. I want to look at the quack doctors. I want to look at the distributors, and I have thoughts on how we're going to use that money when we get it from them. I want to actually use that money to go towards treatment centers for the severely mentally ill. We need them, and I think that will go a long way to also reducing what we have as a homelessness epidemic going on right now. We can and we will use the power of the Attorney General's office for that purpose.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
So were I Attorney General, I would right now be joining those localities that are suing Big Pharma for its contributions to the opioid addiction crisis, one. Two, I think we need to dramatically increase mental health and substance abuse programs, particularly for those coming out of the criminal justice system, in order to get them off drugs and reduce the amount of recidivism. Three, the Attorney General's office has responsibility for a database that is available for pharmacists and doctors to check to make sure they're not overprescribing. All the experts agree one of the biggest ways to stop overprescription of opioids is to get that database up and running. Mr. Becerra, until about 2 or 3 weeks ago, failed to get that database up and running. The San Jose Mercury News, in their editorial, noted that his failure to get that database up and running contributed to opioid overdose deaths. As Attorney General, you've got to do the main job. It's not just about suing Trump. These things matter. Had I been Attorney General, I would have made sure that database was up and running so pharmacists and doctors could check it to make sure they're not overprescribing. He didn't.
Thank you. Mr. Bailey?
Drug addicts don't willingly go get treatment. California used to have a robust system to compel people within the criminal justice system to get into treatment. It was treatment or jail. But thanks to the policies, which are quite frankly failed policies out of Sacramento, we've now gutted that here in California. We weren't compassionate to our drug addicts in this state, and that's why 23,000 have died in the last months. What California needs is to go back and revisit its criminal justice laws. Drug addicts certainly need treatment, and we need treatment locations for them to get treatment. But until they bottom out, they're not going to seek the treatment, and that's what the criminal justice system had been used for. Unfortunately, the administration in Sacramento, including the Attorney General, hasn't been focused on really the compassion necessary to treat our drug addicts in this state.
Thank you. Mr. Becerra?
I feel like Goldilocks, too hot and too cold. I think I'm just right. Right now, the state of California is one of the leads when it comes to a nationwide multi-state action that most every one of the attorneys general throughout the country is engaged in right now, where we're going after not just the manufacturers of opioids, but the distributors as well, because there's evidence that the distribution has been one of the biggest problems, the dumping of these addictive drugs. Less than 2 weeks ago, I announced with one of the U.S. attorneys, federal U.S. attorneys, that we had engaged in a joint investigation and prosecution of a doctor who was overprescribing opioids in the Modesto area, where people were coming from throughout Northern California and the Bay Area, coming to Modesto to be able to get drugs from this guy. We've got to make sure that we don't allow pharmacists and pharmaceuticals to promote those addictive drugs and to allow them to be dumped on the market. But we have to do this in a way that is smart but efficient and fast, because people are getting addicted and dying.
Thank you very much. And the next question from the audience, clearly written by a business owner, and you'll see why. If you are elected the next Attorney General, what are your top 3 priorities, and will they relieve or add to the burden of incessant litigation and over-regulation that California businesses must endure? And we'll start with Mr. Jones first.
My top 3 priorities are criminal justice reform, and by that I mean not only more transparency and accountability for law enforcement, but also making sure we have more reentry and rehabilitation programs for those in the criminal justice system. People are returning to our communities. If we don't make sure they have mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, job training, jobs, affordable housing, they're going to re-offend, they're going to re-victimize, and the whole cycle is going to continue again. We owe it to ourselves to make sure that we expand those programs. As Attorney General, I will lead in that regard. 2, consumer protection. Doing everything we can to make sure we protect consumers. That also means making sure that our markets function competitively. I'll use the antitrust authority of the Attorney General to make sure that's the case, but also going after the underground economy, which hurts businesses and consumers. 3, defending California against all of the inroads of the Trump administration, their efforts to roll back all of the rights that we prize and hold dear as Californians.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bailey?
Yes. My number one priority is public safety and public safety reform, but not in the reform that has been hijacked in Sacramento. The crime rate has continued to go up in this state, and it goes up at double digits. Our first responders are placed at risk. As you're a new Attorney General, my focus is going to be reversing that course, protecting our neighborhoods, our kids and our grandkids.
All right, Mr. Early?
Public safety, number one, we need a seat at the table again for law enforcement. We need, after many years, a friend in the Attorney General's office of law enforcement, not a foe. I want to look at AB 109. I want to look at Proposition 47. I want to look at Proposition 57, what we can do to roll those back. We have to stop letting violent felons out on the street long before their sentences expire. Then there's 2, the three-headed scourge I was talking about. Serious mental illness, homelessness, and prescription drug abuse. 3, the sanctuary state situation. We've got to stop this sanctuary state. There's a prairie fire going on around this state of people, and I support them, opting out of or joining in to the opting out of the sanctuary state law or joining in the Trump lawsuit against it. This is what happens when you have years and years of one-party arrogance coming out of Sacramento. People are taking democracy in their own hands, and they're saying enough is enough.
Keep your applause to a minimum, please.
Right? And then I want one other thing. I want to look at this overtaxation, overregulation scheme that is burying our business community and our people.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
I said at the beginning, public safety has to be the top priority of the Attorney General's office. Last year alone, we collected nearly 3,700 guns, firearms from felons and dangerous individuals in the state of California. We're the only state in the nation that allows us to identify people who are dangerous to their community and allows us then to go after those people to recover those weapons they hold. We do that at the Department of Justice, and we're going to continue to build on that. I want to make sure that we're continuing to work with local law enforcement so we can make sure that we go after the sex traffickers and the drug traffickers that I've mentioned. We've had success in going after gangs. That's because we have a partnership with our local law enforcement authorities. Secondly, consumer protection. The reason we're going after Ashford University, a predatory for-profit college, is because they left a whole bunch of families, parents and students, on the lurch for thousands of dollars, and they gave them no education. The reason we've gone after a lot of polluters is because now you as taxpayers have to pay the bill for that. And the third thing I'll say is that we have to continue to protect the health care that has allowed California to reduce its uninsured rates to dramatic low levels.
All right, thank you very much. The next question is, what role would you play in solving our state's housing and homelessness crisis as Attorney General? And we'll start with Mr. Bailey.
Homelessness is a product of drug abuse and mental illness. And until you address both of those types of problems, you're not going to really address homelessness. This whole business out of Sacramento of dumping money into the communities without a true focus, just building houses isn't going to solve the homelessness problem. The Attorney General needs to be working with the legislature and with the governor to ensure that there are more than just homes, but there are places where people can get treatment. I kind of subscribe to the progressive state of Texas's model, where they have taken and placed money that they were putting into their criminal justice system into the mental health system to take care of the moderately mentally ill. That's the population that needs the treatment. Those are also the ones that are self-medicating. That's our drug abusers at the same time. If we focus on treating our mentally ill, we can do that using the criminal justice system, and the system itself will help address the homelessness issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
Having represented Skid Row in Congress for over 20 years, the most important thing that I learned is that we have to do this in combination. It can't just be the local city law enforcement authorities. It can't just be the county health department. It has to be a combination of everyone. And so what we found is that the first and most important thing you can do to keep someone from becoming chronically homeless is get them housed. And make sure that you have a one-stop shop so that when they have housing, you can provide the mental health services, you can provide the drug diversion programs, you can provide them with the type of support that they need to get back on their feet. And so we have to combine all of that. But there is no doubt that we have to make better investments in finding ways to create more housing stock. And that means being smart, focusing on transit areas so that you concentrate housing around places where people can use public transportation. And we do that in a way that provides some affordable housing to those who are not financially well off. We do those combinations of things where we provide people who are currently housed with moderately priced homes. Then what we can do is make sure that we can start to tackle the homeless problem in the right way.
Thank you very much. Mr. Early?
That all sounds great, but none of that is happening on your watch while you're suing the Trump administration, Mr. Becerra. Listen, I've talked about the three-headed scourge: serious mental illness, homelessness, prescription drug abuse. We have to start dealing seriously with the severely mentally ill. I've talked about housing that I would like to create for them that would help with a good chunk of the homelessness population. Listen, there's 10 cities popping up, every major city in our state. It's got to be dealt with. It's an epidemic. I would want to convene an advisory council of the best and brightest in mental health, in law enforcement, and so. I'd want that advisory council to, among other things, scour the world for success stories on how we deal with those things. And then we bring it back here. We analyze it. We talk. And then we start working with the legislator to start enacting some of these things to dramatically reduce this homelessness crisis. You have to start with an attorney general who cares about these issues first. I care deeply about these issues. With all due respect, I don't believe you do, Mr. Becerra.
Mr. Jones?
So I began my career as a legal aid lawyer representing homeless people, and I understand we need more mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, job training, education, and jobs, and I'll focus on that as Attorney General. But we also need places for people to live. We have a dramatic shortage of housing at all income levels in the state of California. The Attorney General can do something about that. There's a body of law called the Housing Element Law that requires cities and counties to zone sufficient developable land to allow for the development of homeless shelters and housing at all income levels. And guess what? The Attorney General is not enforcing that law. As your next Attorney General, I will enforce that law. I will make sure that communities do their fair share, that they zone land sufficient to accommodate housing, including homeless shelters. And then I'll go beyond that and support development projects that are sound, well-designed, provide housing, and meet a need. We ought to get rid of some of the red tape that's encumbering the ability to provide this housing. The Attorney General can play a role in that as well. So it's all of these programs, but the programs do nothing if you don't also have housing. So I'll fight for housing.
Thank you very much. All right, on to our next question. How do you feel about free speech on college campuses, and how do you feel about free speech zones on campuses, especially when there are campuses, especially when those campuses are funded by taxpayer money? And we'll start with Mr. Bailey.
Yeah. Free speech means free speech, even speech that you disagree with. As Attorney General, I'm going to ensure that free speech on campuses means exactly that. That people who have diverse ideas, even ideas that are objectionable to others, can be articulated on a college campus. You cannot pretend that you have a First Amendment if you're going to suppress speech that you personally don't agree with. As your Attorney General, we're going to encourage speech on our campuses, vigorous debate on our campuses, so that we have the type of speech that people are going to be, that California can be proud of.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones?
So free speech is absolutely essential to our democratic form of government. And free speech in academic centers is absolutely critical because we want to encourage young people, students of all ages, to think critically and to have available to them all the ideas that are out there. But when free speech crosses the line into hate speech and violence, that's where I draw the line as Attorney General. And unlike our president, I think I am capable of telling the difference between Nazis and Klanspeople and peaceful protesters. And when the Nazis and Klanspeople are marching with weapons, law enforcement can say, you know what? Your right to free speech ends at the moment that you're carrying a pickaxe that you're going to use to bludgeon someone with, and we're not going to let you do that. So there's a balance to be struck. And in situations where institutions of higher learning find themselves confronted with violence, then they do, on some occasions, need to say, wait a minute, we're not going to be able to convene this particular gathering because it's going to end up in violence. So it's a case-by-case determination. You have to strike a right balance. I err on the side of free speech, but you also have to make sure there's not violence.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
We send our kids to college so they can expand on their ideas and hopefully come out with the product of what will make them the leaders of this country. And so I would hope that our institutions of higher education continue to give every person, young person, regardless of their politics, regardless of their status, the opportunity to hear every type of dialogue. That is one thing about this country that I think makes us stand above the rest, is we allow speech of every sort. And at the end of the day, we use our best judgment to make sure where we go from there. But even the Supreme Court has recognized that not all speech is allowed under the First Amendment. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater because it would incite a riot. It would incite a stampede. And so we have a right to make sure that we're not letting people try to incite. And if we can just remember that, I think what we can do is try to foment every opportunity possible so that our young people, our future leaders, will have heard every kind of thought and then let them make up their mind.
Thank you very much. Mr. Early?
I support free speech. It's at the heart of our democracy. Ironically, back in the day, the Berkeleys of the world were hotbeds of free speech. Now you go to Berkeley and you say something that the alt-left doesn't support, and they will beat you into submission and make sure you never open your mouth. We need to be able to protect people to say different things, come from different places. We need to encourage people to give different points of view. We cannot keep encouraging and babying this one group that wants to shut people up. What used to be the quote-unquote tolerant group, what sells itself as the tolerant group, are some of the most intolerant people we've ever seen before in our history, quite honestly. They would make Joseph Stalin proud. You say something you're not allowed to say on campus, and they will make sure you never open your mouth again. As Attorney General, I want to watch out and protect for free speech from all sides, not just what the politically correct group tells us we're allowed to say.
Thank you very much. All right, for our next question, this one's from Facebook, and it's a pretty simple one. What is your stance on the Second Amendment? And we'll start with Mr. Becerra.
I am here to uphold the Constitution of the United States of America and of the state of California. The Second Amendment is a long-standing amendment of the Constitution. I respect the right of responsible gun owners to possess their weapons, but I will fight to the dickens to make sure that California's progressive gun safety laws stay in place. I have been sued by the NRA 4 times. We are fighting and winning against the NRA because we want to continue to be able to collect those 3,700 firearms that I mentioned last year that were in the possession of felons and dangerous people. We'll continue to do what we can to make sure that we regulate the use of firearms and the possession and ownership of firearms in a responsible manner, because those who try to do this the right way, responsibly, those who use their weapons for hunting purposes and are very responsible around the home and with their communities deserve to know that the Second Amendment is there to protect them. But let it be known, don't come at us in California to try to undo our gun safety laws.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones?
So the Second Amendment is a fact. It exists. The U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted it in a way that I would disagree with, but I'm duty-bound to follow that interpretation. However, within that interpretation, states have the latitude to enact all sorts of sensible gun control laws, and California has done exactly that, and I will defend those laws. Those laws, importantly, have reduced the incidence and frequency of gun violence. They're good for California, good good for California communities. Now, Mr. Becerra talks about taking 3,700 guns away, but there's 10,000 dangerous individuals in the Armed Prohibited Persons database whose guns ought to be surrendered, and he's failed to take guns from them. These are people that are guilty of felonies, subject to domestic violence restraining orders, or so mentally ill they shouldn't have a gun, and he has failed to get their guns. As Attorney General, I would make sure that we did get those individuals to surrender their weapons, because we're literally hours away from one of those people going off their rocker and shooting up a school like any of the tragic instances we've seen across the United States. So you got to do the job. It's not just about suing Trump. There are important aspects of the job that aren't getting done.
Thank you very much. Mr. Early?
The Second Amendment is more than a fact. It's the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I completely support the Second Amendment. I also support concealed carry. I do support beefing up our background check system. There are holes in it. We need to beef it up. I believe, for example, based on the HIPAA medical privacy laws, when you do a background check, you can't find out whether somebody is severely mentally ill before they get a gun. The severely mentally ill should not be allowed to purchase guns, but I'm a strong Second Amendment supporter. On APPS, the Armed Prohibited Person System, that's a list of felons and other lawbreakers who are not supposed to have guns. The Republican Party has been a long supporter of APPS. They strongly supported giving $25 million to the Department of Justice several years ago to go after those folks. We need to clean up that list, make sure the right people are on the list, and unlike what Mr. Becerra has done, where he's virtually ignored going after those people, those guns need to be taken away from the folks that are properly on that list.
Mr. Becerra, 30 seconds.
So I have to respond to those two last comments, because first, it's a low blow to say to the men and women, my special agents in the Bureau of Firearms, who day in, day out risk their own lives to collect these weapons from people who are felons or dangerous individuals. In more than 10 years, there has not been one incidence of violence where we have removed tens of thousands of weapons. Mr. Jones continues to say that there's a 10,000 list of people holding weapons. What he doesn't tell you is that there were 20,000 before we started working down the backlog. I have a small group of special agents who go out there and do this work. It's dangerous. You don't do it by yourself, and you have to do it in teams. We're doing it, and we're doing it safely, and we should allow them to do their work.
Mr. Bailey, why don't you answer, and then we'll let Ms.
Sure.
Jones.
I'm rock hard on this Second Amendment. I believe that the law-abiding citizens of California have a right to keep and bear arms. I do not support generally the regulations that have been imposed by the Department of Justice. But moreover, I am particularly concerned that it's not guns that are the problem, it's people that are the problem. When you have a list of 10,000 people that are prohibited from possessing firearms, and you're doing virtually nothing day to day to go out and get them, when you've basically deconstructed the Department of Justice in California to the point where you're exactly right. You have a small group of special agents doing the job. Those 10,000 people are the people who've gone out and committed crimes. Those are the people we ought to be focusing on, not law-abiding citizens here in California. It's a travesty that we're spending $32 million a year to get 400 to 600 guns. That's ridiculous.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones, 30 seconds.
So my criticism is not of the law enforcement officers doing the job. My criticism is Mr. Becerra not assigning more law enforcement to do the job. The Attorney General's office has 4,000 employees. There's a 10,000 person backlog of people that by law shouldn't have guns. They're mentally ill, they're felons, they're domestic violence perpetrators. We should get their guns. And if there aren't enough people assigned to do it, then the Attorney General needs to assign more people to do it, get resources to get more people to do it, or collaborate with local law enforcement, but get those guns. So it's not about criticizing the law enforcement officers, it's about the lack of leadership in the Attorney General's office.
30 seconds, then we'll end it.
Yeah. I feel like Michelle Obama. When they go low, I got to go high. Mr. Jones should know, because he's a state elected official. I cannot just shift money in the Department of Justice. I am restricted in the number of special agents that I can have doing this work. When I got into office last year as the AG, I requested more money for the Armed Prohibited Persons System program. I have again requested more money for that program. I am asking for money to be able to expand the number of teams that go out there and do the work. But for Mr. Jones, who should know better, to say that I'm not trying to give the special agents the support they need, as I said, that's a low blow to the men and women who have to do this every day. 10 guns a day, every day of the week, including Saturday and Sunday they do it. Not 400, 3,700, over 18,000 in the last 5 years. That's weapons that are no longer in the hands of felons and dangerous people.
Let me do this. There's a follow-up question related to this. Let me ask that, and we'll throw it to you first, Mr. Early, and you can tie it in here. So the follow-up question from Facebook was specifically to the right to carry guns. I assume that means concealed carry, open carry, that sort of thing. Why don't you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, I support concealed carry. I believe when concealed carry is implemented properly, you let sheriffs and you let chiefs give folks the right to concealed carry weapons, our society is safer, quite honestly. And when it comes down to what Mr. Becerra just said, and I'll even stick up for Mr. Jones here for a second, that was not a low blow against law enforcement. That was a direct blow against you and your office for not using the millions that have been provided to you by the state legislature to go out and get these guns from the folks who are properly on this APPS list. All you have to do is look at the numbers. Look at what you've gone out and gotten. We understand that law enforcement's lives are in danger when they go out and get that stuff, and I support law enforcement unconditionally. But you just have not focused on it in your zeal to sue the Trump administration.
You weren't listening, were you?
Mr. Becerra, you actually get the last word on this one, so we'll go to Mr. Jones.
So I have to say that as a policy matter, I'm not real excited about concealed carry. I'm also not excited about the notion of arming teachers in schools. I think all the science and evidence that's out there indicates that sensible gun control saves lives, although sadly the Republican administration, both in Congress and in the presidency, has tried to block that research. So here in California, we've set up our own research on gun violence. Having said that, sheriffs are allowed to issue permits for concealed carry. That's the law. I think we've got to be very vigilant in scrutinizing how they're exercising their discretion in this regard. But as a policy matter, I'm not real excited about it.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bailey?
Yeah, I support concealed carry. I believe that it ought to be such that any law-abiding citizen in this state who wishes to conceal carry is otherwise qualified and otherwise trained is permitted to get a concealed carry. California has been too restrictive on concealed carry. I also support concealed carry nationwide, and I think all states should have a system that allows for concealed carry and full faith and credit under the Constitution.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
We have a system in California that allows individuals to carry a concealed weapon, and it is one where we allow the local law enforcement authorities to make that call. I think that's wise because a sheriff is the one that's closest to the people in the county and can make the best decision about how many people should be allowed to have concealed weapons, who they are, what training they have, and so forth. That's a wise decision. That's why right now I am engaged in a fight in Washington, D.C. to stop legislation in Congress that would allow nationwide concealed carry. And that would undermine the laws that we have here in the state of California that require that anyone who wishes to carry a concealed weapon go through their sheriff to get that permission. I think California will stand up for its laws. As I said before, the NRA had made it clear that they were going to be suing on this one as well, or try to do everything they could to undermine California's protections against concealed carry nationwide, and we're ready to fight on that. We think, as I said before, that states have a right to decide how to do the public safety for their people, and we'll fight to make sure that that's the case with concealed carry.
Thank you. And if I do say so myself, I'm a fantastic timekeeper. Exactly 3:25. Closing statements. We'll start with Mr. Bailey.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here this afternoon, speak to you, articulate the issues that and my views on those issues. As a retired Superior Court judge with 8.5 years of service, 20 years as a practicing lawyer in this state, certified specialist in criminal law, I think it uniquely qualifies me to enter the office of Attorney General to start on day one, representing the people of the state of California. I'm proud to have the endorsement of the Crime Victims United here in California, of law enforcement throughout the state. We're going to have a cooperative relationship with local law enforcement. We will build a strong Department of Justice here in California, and we will refocus the department, the Attorney General's office, and the 1,100 lawyers that are there on the issues that are problems here in the state of California that impact each and every one of us. We will protect our kids and our grandkids. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jones?
I want to thank BizFed as well for hosting this debate. The differences between me and Mr. Becerra are profound. We agree that we have to resist the Trump administration, but there's a lot more that's not getting done in the Attorney General's office. And neutral observers have noted his failure to make sure that 10,000 people surrender their weapons who by law shouldn't have them, his failure to go after big oil on climate change, his failure to make sure that pharmacists and doctors have a database to check to avoid opioid overprescription. We need an independent Attorney General. Mr. Becerra is taking contributions from the insurance industry, from big oil, from big tobacco. We need an experienced lawyer as Attorney General. Until just at the time of his appointment, Mr. Becerra hadn't practiced law since 1992. We need someone who's going to be committed not only to resisting the Trump administration, but doing all of the important aspects of the job of Attorney General, but not politicizing the office. And that's what I bring to the office. I'll fight for criminal justice reform, defend civil rights, defend immigrants' rights, defend women's rights to access to reproductive health care. The list goes on and on and on. I'm independent. I'm not beholden to anyone. I hope to have your vote on June 5th. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Becerra?
I'm the son of immigrants and the first in my family to get a college degree. Like the dreamers who have talked about being undocumented, unafraid, I will tell you that for me, with optimism running through my veins, I want to take my position as the Attorney General and always say that I am unbowed and unafraid for the people that I represent, for the families, for the values, and the resources that have made us such a great state. And that's why we have gone after the polluters. That's why we have gone after the sex traffickers and drug traffickers. That's why we continue to make sure that the gangs that are out there preying on our kids, we're going after. We're going to do all those things because we have to do this unbowed and unafraid. At the end of the day, what I must be able to tell you is that we're going to continue to keep California strong, creating more jobs than any other state, continue to be the 5th largest economy in the world, because that's what's going to make your kids happy and prosperous. I'm going to fight for that because I know the values that have made my parents and hopefully your families in the future prosperous as well. I hope I can get your vote to be Attorney General for another 4 years. Thank you.
Mr. Early?
Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is a tremendous, tremendous honor for me to be here in front of you. You've heard the candidates. These 3 lifelong political insiders, me the outsider. I'm the son of legal immigrants. Don't let anybody ever tell you that Republicans don't like immigrants. I've never lived off the taxpayers. I'm the only one in this race who's never lived off the taxpayers. I'm the only one in this race who doesn't need this job. I've got a great job. I run a great law firm. I'm doing this for all the right reasons. I'm the only one in this race who's actually a practicing lawyer. Sacramento can no longer tolerate the same old tired politician. Sacramento needs massive and serious change. With these 3, it will be business as usual. With me, you will get new vision, new energy, new ideas. Sacramento has become a tired city that has been dragging down our people, shackling our businesses, and causing the best of us to leave. Together, we can begin bringing back California and its people to the greatness that we and this state deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that does it for me. I'm handing it back to BizFed Chair Gail Ivey. If I can get this off.
That's very good. That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to all 4 of the Attorney General candidates for taking time out of their busy schedule to join us. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I want you to know that, we are all Americans, and we all love this country, and we all believe that every one of you has your heart where it needs to be, and you all want to protect us as Attorney General. So thank you again for your time. And we also want to thank all of your handlers, I like to call them, all your staff that helped get you here on time. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, Moderator Scott Kaufman. Don't you think you did a great job, Scott? Thank you very much. And the questions from the audience were great on Facebook and on the internet. It was wonderful. Again, I'd like to acknowledge the generous support of our event partners, Southern California News Group, BizFed, and the Southern California Gas Company. To our audience here in person and joining via live streamline, now that you have more insight onto the Attorney General race, get your votes in by 8 p.m. on Tuesday, June 5th. Also, save the date for Tuesday, September 18th, as we present the Insurance Commissioner's runoff race at the Southern California Edison Energy Education Center. And that concludes us today. Thank you for the very first Southern California Attorney General Forum. Thank you, everybody.